Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 4. Our theme for the week is the coupling of moral and dietary reform. First, let's review a little bit of what we've been doing through the course so far. I want to address a few common threads I've seen in your responses, both daily and especially the weekly ones. Being able to refer to these, to respond collectively to them, is something we'd be doing in our class discussions, but we'll have to get by with a quick video. In the first week, which seems like a year ago, but in the first week we read a couple of articles addressing research methods in nutrition. And I asked you to think about which one was more convincing. And you did that pretty well. Your answer really didn't matter. I just wanted to get that question in your brains early on, because that's something we're going to continue to think about. I want us to be constantly paying attention to the rhetoric that people use, whether they're physicians or moral reformers, as we'll see in Sylvester Graham, or dietitians, nutritionists, everybody throughout the course. How do people describe their expertise? How do they give advice? How do they try to convince you? So in that first week, part of what I wanted us to think about was the difference between qualitative and quantitative approaches, especially the pros and cons of each of them. And in many ways, pre-modern physicians had Galen, Hippocrates, Cheney, medieval medicine and generally, pre-modern physicians had a much better qualitative understanding of the body than we do, because that's the way they thought about it. Of course, this has many limitations that we don't want any part of. Identifying and treating specific disease-causing agents would be one major drawback to the qualitative approach. But there's kind of an everyday elegance to a qualitative approach to diet and health that still resonates with us and remains appealing in some ways, even though there are clearly advantages to doing it the way that we do in the modern world. But that difference between qualitative and quantitative approaches, there's always kind of a trade-off when you have one versus the other. And so one ongoing question for the course is, can we really combine these? And the knee-jerk response, I think, is sure, why not? Of course we can have the best of both worlds. But they're really different ways of thinking about the world and about creating knowledge about the world. So if I said to you, you should eat a balanced diet, you'd say, okay, sure, that sounds fine. Common sense, right? Is that scientific advice? How do you prove that scientifically? What is balance? How do you define that? For whom? This is an example of sort of expertise versus common sense. Now, can you ever really have scientific advice that says you should eat a balanced diet? Can you scientifically prove that that's superior than some other kind of imbalanced diet? And the answer is not really, right? So we have this sort of common sense view that balance is good, but the scientific view is less certain. And that's where that tension is. If you went to a physician, you paid a lot of money, and the doctor said, eat a balanced diet, you'd say, well, yeah, I know that. I'm paying you for what? For expertise. And this is where we get into Cheney and this idea of sort of hidden knowledge, invisible knowledge that physicians have, expertise that you don't, that goes beyond sort of common sense. It can be easy to think that because pre-modern physicians used an entirely qualitative approach, that they were generally unable to diagnose diseases accurately, or they were able to understand anything. This is a sentiment I sort of got the sense of in many responses, not everyone, but many, that they were kind of limited and just had to do the best they could under certain circumstances. Well, certainly they don't have our knowledge. They don't have our sort of catalog of diseases. They don't have our way of detecting them. But it would be wrong to say that they couldn't diagnose disease accurately because they didn't have adequate technology. Certainly some diseases that we can now diagnose through our technology were unavailable. Duh. But a lot of diseases, especially a lot of basic fevers, a lot of basic, indigestion, there's a lot of ailments, there's a lot of diseases that they named, that they knew about, they recognized the signs, they recognized the symptoms, they understood the prognosis, the course of the disease. They were able to make very effective diagnoses. Clearly different than the way we would do it now, and different level of, you could say, accuracy in some ways. But it would be wrong to say that they had no ability to do anything, right? They were really highly effective within their constraints, right? And it's unfair for us to look back and say, oh, they didn't know anything because they didn't have what we have. They, of course, thought they knew everything, just like we do, right? I want to say a little bit more about the significance of micromechanism, which we read about Monday and Wednesday and got to see in Cheney's writing, his own words on Friday. So the mechanistic view, the mechanistic approach to the body was in line with how people were starting to see the universe as a complex machine that could be entirely understood if investigated carefully and closely enough. We saw this with Descartes and with Newton and other people that were mentioned in the Chapin reading. Won't rehash all that here. I think you got the idea. So what did it matter for a physician? Well, obviously we saw this with Cheney. You had different ways of explaining what was going on inside the body. It might be tempting to think that since Cheney talked a lot about fluids, that they were basically the same thing as what Galen described as humors, and they're basically equivalent. And I want to be very clear that this is an adaptation of Galen's Hippocratic humoralism, but it's definitely not the same thing exactly, because the fluids, they were more physically real than the four humors were. The four humors were kind of in this liminal space between physical reality and just kind of a theoretical construct. But the fluids for Cheney were very real. They were in the body. They were largely invisible to us on the outside of it, but they were there and they went into different structures in the body and they did different things and they got stopped up and they had to pass through different channels and pores. It was very mechanistic. But these fluids were not exactly the same thing. They were much more physically real, and the sort of the viscosity and the fluidity and the vibrancy and so on. These are all things that were more important for Cheney. So it's clearly growing out of humoralism. Cheney wouldn't have described any of his things the way he did without Galen ahead of him. But it's not exactly the same thing. And one reason that Cheney wanted to appeal to these fluids and to the micromechanistic approach was that he was establishing his expertise through the knowledge of the invisible. He knew more than the average person could know, and this is one of the things that differentiated a physician's expertise, so supposedly differentiated a physician's expertise from common sense. Common sense says eat a balanced diet. Cheney can explain to you in mechanistic terms, at least theoretically. I don't know if he actually could, doesn't matter. He could theoretically explain to you why the balanced diet mattered in terms of these fluids and the machine of the body. We might think that because Cheney's micromechanistic approach with the fluids and so on was wrong, as we now know it, obviously, that it must have been largely ineffective in treating patients. That's false, because it was very effective for him in a couple of ways. One, some of the things he talked about in terms of physiology and the mechanics of the body are actually right, even though he talked about it in very different terms than we would. So it's not the case that he was always wrong about everything, but it also allowed him to be an effective physician because it allowed patients to trust him and then do what he said. And yes, he did have extreme diets for patients that had extreme maladies, but most of it, his dietary advice was pretty pedestrian. It wasn't the extreme sort of milk and seed diet. That was very rare for a couple of rare cases. Most of what he wanted to do with his patients was balance, was variety of foods, was moderation. It was very sort of commonsensical, but he could explain it through this mechanistic approach, which kind of gave it a legitimacy that common sense itself didn't have, even though the advice was quite similar. So we saw on Wednesday's reading, especially the two sides to Cheney's expertise in gaining trust, right? He has the mechanical scientific view. That was the focus for Monday. And then on Wednesday was the empathetic physician. He understood what his patients were going through. He had been there himself. He knew that following his advice was difficult. Encouraging them, continuing to have a relationship with them was part of being a successful physician. These ongoing social relationships, you see this throughout Cheney's writings and letters to different patients. That wasn't really the case earlier. Like we didn't see that with Galen. We don't see that in the medieval world. This sort of ongoing sort of social relationships with patients. It's becoming more and more prevalent in the 17th, 18th centuries. Did Cheney actually care about his patients? This is something that came up a lot in various responses. Many of you wrote that he was way too self-interested and conceited to really care. He was just trying to make himself look good and so on. And I would say that, we have to make sure we're reading his text. This is really hard for you to do, not having seen any writings like this before or studying other physicians. We have no reason to believe that Cheney didn't actually care about his patients. There's a lot of language in his writings that makes him sound very self-promotional. We saw that Galen as well. And he sounds very, full of himself, and he can almost sound deceitful in some ways. But that would have made sense for the patients at the time. That wouldn't, we can't look at it from, if you saw a physician now writing like Cheney, you'd be like, this person is crazy. Like, I'm not going to believe this person at all. But at the time, it made a lot more sense. It was a lot more common to write like that. So we really don't have any reason through Cheney's own writings or letters from patients and so on. We have no reason to believe that Cheney or people like him were out to sort of scam patients, but they actually did care about their well-being, and that was part of establishing a reputation and having some success with them, right? Part of having success as a physician was having your patient stick with you through dietary changes, which, in modern terms, we know takes a while to really make a difference in the body. You can't just switch your diet for 3 days and expect to feel totally different. So there's an element of that trust that has to be maintained over time. Was Cheney's advice to his patients based on common sense? On one hand, yes. He told them to have a balanced diet and do things like this that we've seen over and over again, way before Cheney, going back 1,000+ years. But a lot of the advice he gave, even if it sounded like common sense to the patients, he could justify it in very sort of mechanistic terms and very scientific terms at the time. So to answer that question, no, it wasn't based primarily on common sense. He was deliberately trying to go beyond that, even if it wasn't the explanation, right? He did give things that sounded like advice that sounded like common sense to his patients, for sure. But that wasn't what he was primarily basing it on. He was trying to use his expertise and his knowledge of the invisible to better treat patients. Okay, the last topic for this review is a broader point that has come up in many contexts: truth and accuracy in pre-modern medicine. Is there any truth to pre-modern dietary advice? Many of you would have said or did say in some way, no, that pre-modern medicine, pre-modern science is not very scientific. So here's a question: what should count as scientific? And we can really only answer that if we look at what scientific meant at the time. Everything that we've looked at, everything that physicians are saying about how to take care of your body, what constitutes a good diet, how do people get disease and recover from disease, everything that people have said, Galen, Cheney, medieval physicians that we skimmed over, everything is 100% within the context of their way of producing knowledge. It is what we might call more philosophical, because they start with a set of principles like there's 4 elements and 4 qualities. Everything is made up of those. What does that mean for the body? And they sort of go logically through this to explain it. So it's true that classical and early modern dietary advice was more philosophical than our own, but it made sense within their way of explaining the world, explaining the body, explaining health, and so on. Similarly, it's important to note that all rational medicine, starting with Hippocrates and Galen moving forward, as we've discussed, it's always been what we might call now evidence-based, right? We have a very particular definition of that now within our scientific method in medical practice. But evidence-based has always been a key to rational medicine. You have to look at a lot of patients. That slogan that we looked at in the Hippocratic text last week, life is short, the art is long, is perfectly emblematic of that. It's saying that we need to write things down. We need to remember sort of observations that people have made over hundreds of years, over all time. This is how we aggregate knowledge about what a certain fever is. If a physician has to be limited to what personally he or she saw, they'd be totally ignorant about most diseases because they're just not going to come in contact with so many. They can't treat people effectively that way. So we need a way of sort of compiling evidence and basing our theories, adjusting our theories and expectations based on that. So medicine has always been very evidence-based to that extent. Definitions, or what counts as acceptable evidence, has definitely changed over time, right? We have a way of producing knowledge. We call it the scientific method, where people test things are supposedly repeatable, even though that's usually not the case. We write about it in a certain way, right? We create evidence. What evidence looks like to us is very different than what evidence looked like to Galen or Cheney. But it's still evidence for them. So the idea of scientific accuracy is a very tricky concept when considered historically, because the definition of science changes, right? The definition of producing knowledge about the world changes, the way people do that. Galen produced knowledge about the world in a way that was commensurate with how people thought it should be done at the time. Same thing for medieval physicians, same thing for Cheney, using that mechanistic view, right? And same thing for our physicians. So when you say, is somebody scientific or not, you really have to think about, well, what did scientific mean at the time? So Cheney, we might look back and say, this is not very scientific because it doesn't fit our definition of science, but it certainly fit his definition of science for people, his contemporaries at the time. Remember that Galen, Cheney, everyone else we're reading, everyone sees themselves as like modern doctors working at the pinnacle of knowledge. They know more about medicine than everyone that had come before them. The world has new diseases. There's old diseases. People don't take care of their health the way they're supposed to. So when you read people like Cheney, it looks like a totally different world. And in many ways, yes, obviously it is a totally different world. But a lot of the attitudes about diet and health have been very constant, right? They're doing their best with the knowledge they have, the technology they have, the way of producing knowledge to help people as much as they can. So it's very easy, because it's so different from our system, to look back and say, oh, these people didn't know anything. They were ridiculous. We have to keep in mind, they think of themselves the same way our modern doctors think of themselves, right? The reason I think it's valuable to look at the history of medicine in this way is it gives us a different perspective on our own limitations, our own assumptions that we never question. Like, we don't question the scientific method. We just take that for granted, that is how it's supposed to be. But in 500 years, when people are taking, a version of this class where they look back at our diet and health and say, why did these people do that? That kind of perspective is one thing I want to get into, or that kind of question is one thing I want to get into your mind. So when you read anything about medicine or science or anything like that, you think about sort of the cultural relativism of it. Like, we're all products of our own time. And what seems inevitable and best to us, it is to us. But that's certainly not the way it always will be, right? It's stating the obvious in a way, but it's very easy to lose track of that as well. Okay, so it would be wrong to say, sort of the upshot of this whole thing is that it would be wrong to say that medical knowledge about diet is becoming more scientific as we move through the course so far, right? It's not becoming more scientific. It's becoming more like our science, maybe. That would be fair to say. But is it becoming more scientific generally? No, because it's always been scientific in the sense that it matches the way people thought they should understand diet and health at the time. Okay, that's it for the review lecture.